It's good to see everybody back tonight. It's good to see those that are visiting with us. If you are visiting with us, we appreciate your presence so much. I see that Tommy and Shirley have moved seats, so something must not be going real well up this way this week. It's been a great week. Appreciate Daniel's prayer, the great song leading that we've had. And tonight we're going to finish out our meeting. And we're going to talk about it's not how you start, but how you finish. And we'll have 2 points in our lesson. 2-point lesson. I'm not much for Olympics, but spontaneously, in the last couple of years, I happened to have on the television one day the Winter Olympics. Now again, don't ask me any questions about the Olympics after services because I'm about to tell you all that I know about the Winter Olympics right here. But there was skiing going on and they were racing, so I don't even know what it's called, but they're racing and they're using skis. You would think I would know more than that. But as they're racing with their skis, they've got their flag and on the bottom part of the screen, what place they're in. And as I'm watching it, there's 3 people that are way ahead of everybody else that I'm thinking, well, this ain't even a race. This is a blowout. It's not even fun. But as I'm doing something in the television zone, they get to the last lap. And a lap in this thing's pretty long, so it's not like a lap you might think of as a small lap. And I hear the announcers going crazy, and they're like, Russia's catching up, or whatever country it is, and all of a sudden, it's like somebody went out there and gave these guys in the back of the pack some kind of shot that just gave them extra energy and a boost of nitro because they're just getting it like they've been half-heartedly going. And you're watching and you're thinking, there's no way they're going to come back and make this a race. And they come all the way back and overtake some of the guys in the front and win the race. I'd never seen anything like it. I'm sitting there as a spectator saying, hey, there's no way these other guys have a shot. Yet they came back and won. And I'm sitting there looking at the other guys saying, there's no way these guys are going to lose, and they lost. And I'm going to tell you how that relates to the church. I've seen people that have been baptized into Christ for the remission of their sins, that have served God faithfully for an extended amount of time, and I would have said, you know what? They're going to be faithful Christians unto death. And then I've seen them fall away. Something in their life triggers and something happens, and I've seen those people that I would have never dreamed fall away and not finish strong. And then I've seen others who people probably gave up on in a sense. Who people thought, you know what, I'm not sure that they'll ever truly serve God faithfully. And then something happened in their life, and they became very faithful. And they finished their life on this earth very strong. And I want you to think about that tonight in our lesson. The first of our 2 points is some started off great. They started off strong, but they did not finish well. Can you think of anybody in the Bible who comes to mind there? It sounds like the New York Mets, don't it, Daniel? You were checking that phone. They started off pretty good this year. They had the lead. They were showing last night on TV that they had the division lead for 170 games, and the Braves have had it for 5, but they won the division. What about in the Bible? Can you think about anybody in the Bible that would relate to? What about Judas? What about Judas Iscariot? Let's look at a few passages on Judas. Turn to Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3. And as we're going through this lesson, you need to think about yourself. If you're not a Christian, it's not too late, and you're going to see that in this lesson. If you are, it's not too late to fall away or to lose your soul, and you're going to see that in this lesson as well. We're in Mark chapter 3. Let's read verses 13 through 19. And he went into a mountain and called unto him whom he would, and they came unto him, and he ordained 12 that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach and to have power and to heal sickness and to cast out devils. And Simon he surnamed Peter, and James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder, and Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Canaanite. And look at verse 19. And Judas Iscariot, which also betrayed him, and they went into a house. Judas starts off by being selected as one of the 12 apostles. Now, I'm here to say that if you get selected as one of the original 12 apostles, you're doing something right. Jesus didn't go out there and randomly draw people out of a crowd. He picks 12 people intentionally and purposefully. And Judas is one of those people. So if you look at Judas and you say, how does he start? Things are going pretty good. But let's go back to Matthew at chapter 26 and let's see what happens next. We're in Matthew chapter 26. This time we're going to look at verses 14 through 16. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said unto them, what will you give me? And I will deliver him unto you. And they convened with him for 30 pieces. Convened with him for 30 pieces of silver. That's all it took. And from that time he sought opportunity to betray him. Who's him? Jesus. He's going to betray Jesus. So if we're looking at this in a lifeline sequence, selected as an apostle, betrays Jesus, or takes the silver to betray Jesus. And then if you look at the next chapter, chapter 27 at verses 3 through 5, then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned and that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, departed, and went out and hanged himself. That story didn't end well, did it? Judas, selected as an apostle, things going pretty good. Takes 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus, and then we end with Judas hanging himself. He started off pretty good. Started off well. Didn't finish strong. When I was younger, I played Little League Baseball my whole life, then played high school sports after that. Baseball was my favorite. And in Little League Baseball, I'll never forget, when I was about 9 years old, I was about this size, and we had some guys on our team about this size. And they could throw the ball a lot harder. They could hit the ball a lot further. And usually they were better at that age. The bigger the kid, the better they were, generally speaking, except for speed. But you know, there were some of those kids that about 9 or 10 that were this size, when they were 18, they weren't an inch taller or any bigger. It's like they peaked, if you will. And then you saw others that overcame them. Now, in a physical sense, that really doesn't have a lot of bearing on life. But in a spiritual sense, Judas peaked way too early. He started off good, and he didn't finish strong. I'll give you another example. What about Demas? Do you remember Demas? Look at Philemon chapter 1 at verse 24. Philemon 1 at verse 24. Do you remember this guy? He's not somebody in the Bible that you would just talk about all the time. So let's make sure we remember who this is. I'm in Philemon 1 verse 24, of course. It says Marcus, Aristarchus, and notice the next name, Demas and Lucas. And then what's he say about them? My fellow laborers. Paul is saying these are my fellow laborers, and included in that list is Demas. So he's a good guy. He's a fellow worker, right? Well, that's not the only time we see that. Look at Colossians 4, verse 14. Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. You see the same idea. Paul here says, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. So here's what we've got so far. Demas is a fellow laborer, and Demas is greeting the brethren, but Demas isn't done. He started off good. So far, good Demas. But notice 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10. 2 Timothy chapter 4 at verse 10. Notice what we see about Demas here. For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica. Hold on. Isn't this Demas that earlier was a fellow laborer of Paul? He was greeting the Christian brethren in the book of Colossians. And now what do we see about Demas? He's forsaken me. Why? Having loved this present world. He was doing really good. But he fell off the track somewhere. What about us? You know, the thing about this, as we look at our last point, is this building tonight, within the last 20 years, or however old this building is, I know it's a relatively new building, probably has had a lot of people sitting in this building that came forward, that were baptized here or somewhere else, and for a while they were doing really good. And like Demas, they started falling in love with things of the world. Their careers, maybe a person that wasn't a faithful Christian, maybe hobbies and entertainments that just draw and attract so much of their time that God can't be first anymore. And that's what happened. People fall in love. So they started off doing really good as faithful Christians, but the world slowly starts to pick them apart. What about us? Is it possible that that's happened to you before, or that it could happen to us moving forward? Absolutely it is. One more last example in our first point. What about King Saul? Let's go back to the Old Testament. Let's go back to the Old Testament here in Samuel, and let's look at King Saul. We'll go to 1 Samuel chapter 15 and start at verse 10. 1 Samuel chapter 15 at verse 10 and 11. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repents me that I have set Saul to be king. Now hold on. God put Saul to be king. Why? Because he was doing well. He got in that position for doing good. But what is God saying now? I wish I'd have never done that. For he has turned his back from following me, and he has not performed my commandments. And it grieved Samuel, and he cried to the Lord all night. Skip down to verse 19. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but did fly upon the spoil, and did evil in the sight of the Lord? Look at verse 23. Saul has done evil. He didn't obey him. He took the spoil. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected thee from being king. You know, everything's going good for Saul. He's king because he's done well and God's put him in this position. But he disobeys God here. So what started out well is taking a wrong turn. And he's de-seated as the king here. He started off strong, but he didn't finish well. What about us? Before we move to our second point, let's wrap this first point up. Maybe you're here tonight and you started off strong and zealous and faithful, but something's changed in your life, and lately you have not been very strong in your faith. Somebody has changed you, and God is just not first in your life, and you're not finishing very well. You're not running your race as a Christian should. We need to think about that. And we need to make sure that we take appropriate actions and change that before it's too late. But I want to spend the rest of our time on something way more positive. And as we finish out this meeting, I hope you'll really listen to these next few points. Some started off poorly, but they finished strong. Now, I'm not sure that every example of a faithful Christian that took a while to start being really faithful started off poorly, so that may not be an accurate statement. But I'll share this. I grew up at Piney Grove Church of Christ in Tuscumbia. I'm very disappointed if you've never been there. You've got to come to our next meeting. If you all come, we will have a building full, I promise. We can seat about 95 to 100. My mom and dad took me to services most of my life, all my life, I should say. And when I was 16, I obeyed the gospel. And just a few months after that, our preacher had been sick and missed a lot, and we didn't have anybody to step up. And I said, I'd like to give one of the invitations, if that's okay. So I did that. Then I called our preacher and I said, I'd like to come work on a PowerPoint and do a lesson one day, and he helped me prepare a PowerPoint. I preached my first lesson, and the rest is history. But along the way, what I haven't told you yet is my dad wasn't a Christian. Now, he was a good role model. He brought me to services, and he came from a family that had Christians in it. And he didn't have any vices in his life where you would say, you know what, this is it. This is why he hadn't obeyed the gospel. I can tell you that there wasn't anything like that. But I did a lesson from Amos chapter 8 one day, Daniel. A famine for the word of the Lord. I'll never forget what I preached on. And I don't know if it was something that day or something over the years he had heard, or all the preachers that had studied and talked to him before, or my mom, or his parents, or whatever it was. It was a culmination of all the things he had heard. But there he came down the aisle. He was 49 years old, and I baptized my dad. And he's been a very faithful Christian since, and he was a good man before that. But you see, that's a feel-good story to me because it was super encouraging, and I love my dad. But there's probably people in this audience today that are 49 years old, or maybe older. I've known of people that have obeyed the gospel in their 80s. It's not too late. It's not how you start, it's how you finish. And I want to go on past that because this is going to hit more people. So really listen to what I'm about to say. You may be in the audience tonight and say, you know what, well, I've always sort of went to church, but I've never really been that involved and dedicated in the work of the church. I've never really done anything extra. I've never really done anything other than, really go to services. And I need to grow. It's not too late. You may not have been one of the Bible class teachers or the song leaders or one of the most faithful attendees. It's not too late to finish strong. And the reason that's so important is your soul's on the line. We need workers in this kingdom. If you want to see this congregation grow, it's going to take more than the elders and the preachers. It's going to take everybody doing their part, fitly joined together with the mindset of let's all give it all we got, and when we get on that page, we can finish strong. The common thing today is churches are shrinking. Numbers are going down. Why don't we buck the trend? Why don't we do everything we can to grow closer to God and see churches grow? But it starts with us growing individually and finishing strong. And I want to show you 3 examples of that in the lessons yours. Please follow along with me. And if you haven't been the most faithful Christian you can be, let this motivate you to do it. And if you're not a Christian, it's not too late. The first one, Saul of Tarsus. There's no better example in my mind, guy, of someone who started off poorly but finished strongly. Saul starts off by persecuting Christians. He's literally a rival, an antagonist to the church, to other Christians. Look at Acts chapter 7 at verse 58. Here what you have is the stoning of Stephen. What's Stephen doing? He's preaching the gospel. What's Paul doing? He's at the feet of those who were stoning him. In Acts 7 verse 58, and cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul, Saul of Tarsus. But you know what? Saul makes a transformation along the way. And he turns into Paul. Paul that wrote 13 of our 27 New Testament books of the Bible. Paul that preached the gospel and did so much for the work of the kingdom of the Lord. Look at 2 Timothy. Chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. I'm making sure it shows on your screen. My screen's a touch different here. 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 through 8. Notice what Paul says to Timothy. He's talking to a young preacher in this setting. And he says, "For I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished." That's a key word right there. "My course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day. And not to me only, but," guess what? Here's all of us in this passage. "But to all them also that love His appearing." You know what Paul's saying? We could read a lot of passages on Paul to make this point. But he started off poorly, persecuting Christians, giving his word against their lives at times, hurting the church, wreaking havoc, to now writing 13 of our 27 New Testament books, letters, preaching the gospel, being an apostle of Christ, and saying he has fought a good fight and kept the faith. What about us? There's got to be somebody in this audience who's similar to that. You didn't start as a Christian, but you became one, and you're as faithful as they are now, and you're ready to meet your Lord. You're ready for that crown of righteousness. You see, there's so many that start off strong, but they end up falling away. They've got the pedigree, they're raised in the church, they're taught the truth, they know, and they just let it slip away. They're not diligent to make their calling and election sure. But then there's others who don't start strong. And maybe you're here tonight, and you have not been the faithful Christian you need to be. Turn it on. Start now. Get in this race and get to running. Because that prize we're running for is very much worth it. And Paul, is a good example of that. What about the prodigal son? Let's go to Luke 15. You've probably read this parable over and over throughout your time studying the Scripture, as it's one of the best examples of learning in the Bible that we have, one of the stories Jesus tells here. Let's start in verse 11. Jesus telling the parable here of the prodigal son. Listen to what we have here. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. And he divided them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and he took his journey into a far country, and there he wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have fain filled his belly with husk that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, look, that's the key passage there. When he came to himself, when he woke up and said, what am I doing? How am I living? Look where I'm at. Look what I'm doing. When he started thinking straightly, when he used his common sense and he came to himself and he set his pride aside, he came to himself. And he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father, but when he was a great way off, his father saw him, had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And then later his father makes the statement, down in verse 32, it was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Listen. You may be like that prodigal son in various ways. You may not have taken an inheritance and went out and lived in terrible living. You may have been a good moral person your whole life. You may be, as Paul would say, the chiefest of sinners in your thoughts. Whatever the case is, it's not too late. It's not how you start, it's how you finish. And here he is. He started off very poorly. He's wasted his dad's money and inheritance that he's been given. He's basically made a fool of himself by doing this, and he's shamed his family and himself. But he comes to his senses. And a lot of times that's our relationship with God. God's given us everything, and we go out and we waste all the blessings God's given us. We waste a lot of time God has given us. We waste a lot of opportunities. But if we'll come to ourselves and say, you know what, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. My Father's waiting on me. God has been long-suffering and patient. I need to make things right and make some changes. Just like His Father, our Father's standing there waiting on us. As it's written in Revelation 3, He's standing there knocking. Are we willing to open the door? He started off very poorly, the prodigal son did. But he finished strong by coming back to his father. He was dead, but now he's alive again. He was lost, but he was found. One more example. Let's go to Matthew 21. This person doesn't have a name in this parable, so I call him the one brother of Matthew 21 because we don't have a name. But if you'll turn there to Matthew 21, we'll see this. We're in Matthew 21, verses 28 through 30. Very short parable Jesus told here. Matthew 21, starting verse 28. But what think ye? A certain man had 2 sons. Now listen to this and envision this in your mind. You've got 2 boys. Notice what happens. He came to the first and said, Son, go work today in my vineyard. The son answered and said, I will not. All right, listen now. Son, go work in my vineyard. No, sir, I'm not going to go. That's not a good start, is it? Telling your dad, no, I'm not going to go. But look what happens. But afterward, he repented and went. So he starts off poorly, he finishes strongly. Look at the second son. And he came to the second and said likewise. And his second son answered and said, I go, sir. But he went not. Which of these two did the will of his father? Whether of them twain did the will of his father? They said unto him, the first. Jesus said unto them, verily I say unto you, that the publicans and harlots go into the kingdom of God before you. What's Jesus saying? There's these two boys. One of them says, Daddy, I'm not going, but he repents and he does what his daddy tells him. The second one says, I'll do it, and he never does it. So it's our lesson, it's our entire lesson in a nutshell. One started off poorly, but he ended up repenting and doing it, and he finishes strongly. One starts off strongly by saying, I'll do it, but he doesn't do it. So he finishes poorly. And Jesus said, which one? Which one did the will of his Father? The one that started off poorly but finished strongly. That's the one. Not the one that started strongly but finished poorly. Now here we are in this audience tonight at O'Neill. What about you? Everybody has a different start, a different background, and a different place that they're at right now. You may not have started off strongly, but you can leave here tonight and you can start finishing strongly. You can get it going in the right direction right now. But you know what I'm afraid of? I'm afraid there's a lot of people that started off strongly, but they're going to finish poorly. They've got that Demas in them where they start to love the world. They've got that Judas in them where they start to betray Jesus. What about us? What about us? Many start out strong and faithful for the Lord, yet they drift away into the world. Their zeal slowly goes away. Does this describe where you are spiritually right now? Sunday morning we had 251 people. We started strong. Monday and Tuesday we didn't have quite as many. Now I know that there's always a few examples that have real good reasons. But it's like that everywhere I've ever been. What about us? Which one describes us and the relationship that we have with God and Christ right now? Others start off unfaithful, living in sin, but something happens in their life and they become more spiritually minded. Then before you know it, they're faithful Christians and they're leaders in the church. Which one describes you? I look around and I see a lot of young men in this audience, a lot of young women in this audience. You may not have been some of the main leaders or workers here at O'Neill, but you can start being. You can turn it on. You can find ways to help the church here, to work in your homes, at your jobs, to be a Christian example, and to really finish strong with your faith so that you can have that crown of life that Paul was telling Timothy about. So you can fight that good fight and you can finish that course. I want to end on a story and the lesson's yours. There was a man who was mining for gold, and he had spent all this money to buy the equipment to mine for gold. And you remember back when everybody was heading out west towards California and they're mining for their gold. People still do it to this day in certain locations. And he had worked really hard for a long time, really hard, and he was tired and he was give out, and he just was having no luck at all. Just not really reaping any benefits or finding any gold. And so he decided he was going to sell his equipment and just call it quits. So a guy came along that was in the business or wanted to be. He made him an offer on the equipment and he bought it. 3 days later, they got word that the guy that bought the equipment had started it back up, and 3 feet from where they stopped mining, they struck over $1 billion worth of gold. 3 feet. He was that close, but he gave up and he quit. Now, I can't count to 1 billion. I need a calculator for that. But let me tell you something. We're this close to heaven. And it's more valuable than any amount of money, than any amount of power or fame or fortune we could ever imagine. It's the most precious place and valuable asset we could have is our soul being in heaven. And we've got people that are giving up 3 feet away. We've got people that are loving this world and they're starting to find their gold here. They're starting to make their homes here and they're giving up 3 feet away. And it's seen in the small decisions and choices that we make every day. What about you? Don't give up 3 feet from that goal. Don't give up when you're that close to getting to heaven. I don't care how you started. If you started strong and you're strong, stay strong. If you didn't start strong and you started poorly, turn it around right now. Let's get on fire for the Lord and let's finish strong. If you're here tonight and you've never obeyed the gospel and you're ready to start by becoming a child of God and you're ready to get into this race and you're ready to start working for the Lord, why not now? Why not start strong tonight? If you've done that, but you've been a no-show lately, you've been missing in action, you haven't been faithful, whatever the case is, you've started to give up 3 feet from goal. Come to your senses like the prodigal son did. Like the brother in Matthew 21 who repented and did what his father said. Make the changes necessary to make sure you get that crown of life that Paul was talking about. Whatever the case is, if you're here tonight and you've got a need, leave here with the mindset that you're going to finish strong and you're going to make sure that you do all that you can to get to heaven and that you bring others with you. And if we can help you, why don't you come just sing the song that's been selected. Oh, do not